been doing this for.
We've been
doing this for just over a year and a half now. Just finished our second crop in our trial plot, which was a large tunnel. And I have to say, one of the reasons we started looking at this seriously was due to labour. But I would argue that it's sort of a long game, because if you can get a balance in the soil and reduce your weed pressure, you're going to have a greater yield because you have less loss of your crop. If you're weeding less, obviously that's one burden I don't have to deal with. So that the benefits are sort of, it's not so straightforward as doing less work, it's being able to use your workforce in other ways which are more productive. I think that's where the real benefit is.
Can you expand on that, Glenn?
Just to answer that one very quickly, is Paul Carey, who's gone from Paul Carey, who went on that field. He had 16 people on that field picking potatoes. So let me just walk through this, or talk you through the process. Initially, the farmer would have to inject an insecticide or nematicide to actually, that was one tractor. Then he would have to plough it. Then he'd have to harrow it. Then he'd put in some more chemicals. I've heard of potato farmers putting in up to 60 chemicals to keep their potatoes going at times. And then there's weekly or every 2 weekly there's spraying of chemicals. So you can imagine the labour and the workforce needing to do that and picking the potatoes. By moving to regen, you're actually utilising the workforce of the soil. So you're actually doing what Mother Nature does. Just like forests are the most productive systems that we know of, but they don't have a workforce keeping them productive. We just need to move our agricultural systems into that same sort of mentality, learn from Mother Nature, and use her workforce. There's billions of microbes in the soil. We're a bit silly killing them off. They're our workforce. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah.
Sorry, we'll come across there.
I'm just wondering about the yield. Are you finding the crop yield is the same as you had before?
So we're probably slightly down, but the trial piece of land that we've used was driven over for about 10 years, so it was very compacted. It was also very heavy soil. But you know, if I could dig a piece of this soil in front of you now, you would actually see that the clay platelets have been broken up by the microbiology that's been introduced. So the soil is actually quite soft now, and the amount of moisture it's holding, I think we irrigated in this tunnel twice this year. So we're not really drawing on the water resources around us either, which is good.
Sorry, yes, Stevie?
What are we talking about cost-wise here? Because you know it's going to be expensive.
Thank you, Steve. This is probably the best example I've got at the moment. If we just look at the chemical system at the moment, roughly 9,100 initially. That's to actually farm chemically for 1 year.
Right.
Very roughly. Okay, this is specific and it's going to alter between farmers.
What about on regen?
On the regen, on the first one, if we go for if I was doing the services, it's another £1.5 roughly. With Justin, he had to pay for the training,
right.
So there was the extra cost. What's really interesting, and these are taking in everything, every single factor. So the labour, the tools, the chemical. You know, I've really nailed it on the figures on this one. I've been pushed really hard on them. So you can see it's how fast it drops off once you actually start to, the system start. It's like coming off a drug. When you first come off a drug, you're going to have hiccups possibly. But once you're off it, and you've got Mother Nature then doing what she does best, then you see the benefits.
Okay, what would you have done with 26 million that was wasted on the hospital so far?
Regenerate Jersey.
Thanks very much, Dave.
Any other questions this side? Should we go across? Sorry, can I go to that corner down and come back?
Yeah, I was just wondering how you think this method of farming would deal with acute problems such as, I don't know, blight or just sudden attacks, or one whether it's a particular pest or whether it's a particular disease.
That's a
how do you
really,
deal with that?
really good question. And if you notice, we're not calling ourselves soil associated organic or organic like that. If the farmer chooses to put in the, as we say, the chemical or the antibiotic, they can. We're not saying no to it. But what we're saying, if you decimate the soil biology, you rebuild it. So there's extra cost for the farmer to do that. But if he needs to do that. It's like us. When we're sick, we take antibiotics. That's perfectly fine, but we also got to take probiotics afterwards to rebuild our system, to reboot our system. Nature is exactly the same. Should we take a...
This is really for Nigel. We hear an awful lot about three things these days: glyphosates, neonicotinoids, Roundup. First of all, can you just, for the public, explain the three and how they're interrelated? Sorry, it's about 2 hours. Well,
you have to remind me which one I'm meant to be talking about. Glyphosate is a chemical that is developed which plants absorb through their leaves, but then they take it down into their roots, and systemically it kills the roots right down into the soil. Monsanto, who are the main proponents of this chemical worldwide, say that it's perfectly safe, and there's this famous moment when there was a Monsanto representative on Newsnight or somewhere, and they put a glass, which looked like a glass of water in front of him, and said, "No, that's a glass of your product. If it's so safe, why don't you drink it?" Of course he didn't. They also say that this stuff deteriorates and quickly in the soil, but of course it doesn't. Now there is debate. Glyphosates are illegal in some parts of the world and still legal in others, so the argument is not over, but of course Monsanto are pouring a fortune into keeping the waters muddied in that area. Glyphosate is used extensively in Jersey. You can see where blight has touched a few potato plants in a field, and that area has been zapped brown with glyphosate. Glyphosate is also used extensively in the idea of cover crops and no-till, where people plant their cover crop and then glyphosate it when it's time to plant the next crop. This is just pouring, the worst on top of the worst in terms of the soil. What was the second one?
Neonicotinoids.
Neonics. They are, or nicotine, you got the clue in the name there. They're natural chemicals formed in plants, like nicotine is formed in a tobacco plant, but they are deadly poisons, and they're used particularly as poisons against insects. Insecticides, pesticides. There's some words I really hate. Pest, vermin, weed. These are all words we use when we want to demonize part of the natural world. So neonicotinoids are pesticides. In other words, they kill insects. Of course, they can't distinguish one insect from another, and one of the insects that they have been proven to be devastating are the bee populations. So neonicotinoids have been really found to be the culprits in the the massive decline of bee populations going on. We can't afford to go out killing animals, demonizing entire classes of animals, such as insects, and just deciding we're going to eradicate them. This was an idea. I mean, there's been this idea for about a century, this idea that God made mistakes. He gave boys foreskins, he gave people tonsils, and that it's our duty to correct his little mistakes. And there's a book called Sailing Alone Around the World, A World of My Own, by Robert Knox Johnson. In that he talks about taking his army rifle, his Enfield 303 with him, in case he sees any sharks, because he would enjoy sitting on the top of his boat shooting sharks with an army rifle as a form of entertainment. Because somehow in his strange world, he was convinced that sharks were another one of God's little mistakes. They just needed eradicating because they were wicked and evil. We can't afford this view of life. The third thing was?
How those two relate to Roundup.
Roundup is a concoction. Roundup is Monsanto's product, and it's a concoction, mostly glyphosate, but all kinds of other things. Secret recipe. It's a trademarked, a trade-protected commercial secret. But it's almost certainly worse than pure glyphosate. And I don't know that it contains neonicotinoids. Probably it does, but it certainly contains a concoction of things which make the effects worse. So as I said, some places in the world have banned glyphosate already. Others have simply banned Roundup because as a concoction it's worse than glyphosate on its own. So yeah, don't get me started. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
You said then that the government didn't assist organic gardening, farming rather, and were not behind it. Are we talking just about the battle of money over doing the right thing?
Another great question. I don't think so, no. I think it's trying to understand the mentality of where we are at the moment, and it's no one's fault. The story of how we actually got to where we are, why are we so dependent on chemical fertilizers? And it all goes back to the war days when fertilizers were invented by the Germans to extend the war. They also happened to be bomb-making material, as you probably know. Thrown out onto the grass, they did great things, but we had no way of actually measuring what the consequences are. We are paying for those consequences now, 100 years later. So the whole farming mentality moved from father to son, to government to farmer, and governments obviously get all their information from academia, and academia get their funding from pharmaceuticals. So you can see the natural progression, how it's gone. But biology is not being really studied in agriculture. If you go through an agricultural degree, you're actually covering a lot of the chemical and the physical side of things, but not the biological. The biological is really something as new as 1995 when Dr. Elaine Ingham did all of her research work on the microbes and managed to actually figure out the functional groups and which ones are important and which ones we need to look after, such as the fungicides. Nematodes are very important. You've got the predatory thing, yet we've got nematicides, and then you've got the herbicides and all the rest of it that carry on. So it's an area that we need to look at a little bit more deeply.
We'll take one more question, if you don't mind, and then I'll do a bit of a wind up.
I'll take a couple.
Yeah, what I'm going to say is, if you don't mind, then we'll take one more question publicly, and then when we've finished and you do the taste test and the signing, we're all here to talk to individually.
Okay. Yeah, the potatoes are getting cold. Sorry, boys.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask, how many people have read the Rural Economy Strategy? Okay, so just a few. Because what we are talking about is how we actually fund and move to organic farming. And if you look at this document, the way that it actually doles out subsidies is to do with the amount of land and productivity. So that is why it doesn't support organic farming. What it supports are the bigger bodies, because most of the people with smaller farms don't even bother with these subsidies because they say that it's nothing. But of course, if you've got a lot of land, you get more. So what I really am saying is that in order to support this, we do need to pay a lot more attention to this strategy. It doesn't even have a proper policy for food security. It's actually just got something saying, oh, most of the Jersey public think we ought to look to the supermarkets. Now, I really would ask you, have a look at this document, and if you don't end up slapping your head like I did, then you're a much better person than me. But that's where I really feel we need to put some of that energy and understand, look at the way we cost it, and look at a way in which we can actually divert those funds so that we can support people over this sort of period where you have this transition, where you're going to have this dip, because some of the farmers are saying, well, we have to put some of the soil, we can't farm it if we're going to go with organic methods, so we lose money. And that's really perhaps where the support needs to be directed.
Thanks, Mark.
Do you want to do one more question? Sorry, there was sorry, Tony.
Yeah, fine. I'm just wondering if it makes using the compost tea and the compost, if it makes the plants more resilient to disease?
Compost is the key to it, because compost is basically microbial food. But you've got to get the right mix right. So, for example, Jersey has chosen to adopt the European waste legislation law, even though we're not in Europe. And we've made it even worse because of the potatoes that were up at Boatwater, whatever problem. So it's now Only TTS or DFI can actually compost, and the problem is we're not getting microbially diverse compost from them, so we're just getting organic matter in effect. So it's not really compost. They don't call it compost, they call it soil improver. So compost tea is only extracting those microbes from the compost. Compost is the ideal. Compost tea is a little bit more expensive and complicated and adds to the cost. But because I can't compost in Jersey, I've had to develop the compost tea system. It's not ideal. Composting is the best and by far the cheapest, but unfortunately legislation in Jersey does not allow me to even take coffee grinds down to the TTS composting site, but I can buy glyphosate. No reason.
Can you just quickly say how much compost tea you need per hectare?
Can we have that in verges?
In verges. Well, let's just say, how many verges to the hectare? If there's about 8. So I'm using 12 kilos for 1 hectare, so do the maths on that one. 12 kilos of compost will actually put enough microbes into the soil to regenerate the soil. So you don't need a lot of it, but the thing is we really want to compost as if Jersey depends on it, because what's the point of burning off organic matter, which is microbe food? You know, burning that off at the incinerator, which has got a moisture content which produces dioxins and lowers the actual temperatures in the incinerator. It just doesn't make sense. But let's adapt the composting rules and regulations. Let's start composting properly. You know, it's just about a mixture. Compost is carbon, nitrogen, in getting the mixtures right, that's it. So we've just got to legislate correctly. John?
Just on picking up Moz's theme there about support from government. Once upon a time we had a department from agriculture that used to contain people with scientific knowledge. They had laboratories, they had research, they did trials, and so there was, in my view, looking back in those days, there was some arrangements to at least new things, new ideas, new thinking could be trialled. Can you tell us what's the situation now? Is it just what kind of support is available in terms of government? You know, I remember we used to have, for example, the Director of the Environment had a whole scientific CV, vast experience in all these areas. What have we got now? Can you just tell us?
It's a difficult one. We don't have anything really. We used to have, is it Warwick Farm or something? There was actually the research centre up there, and then for some reason that got dropped and we became dependent on DEFRA policy. So we were picking up the remains of what was happening, so we were like a year or two behind DEFRA. I think there's an opportunity here to start to do a proper, funded scientific trial if that's what's needed. I think the trials have already been done. I think the evidence is quite stark. We just need to now support it. Support farmers like Justin, definitely, because he's on his own. He's done it. He doesn't need my input anymore. He's running on his own, but he's got no support. He's taking risk. And support farmers like Paul. Paul cannot sell his regenerative potatoes in Jersey because the market will not accept them. They are beyond organic, high nutrition potatoes. They put the R back into the royal, and no one will buy. The current wholesalers won't buy them off him.
Why?
Because we're just, like someone said earlier, we're looking at quantity rather than quality. We're more interested in numbers than we are actually in health.
I think we should go back to the drawing board and get rid of the sea litter, everything. I mean, there's the answer.
So the potatoes are getting cold at the end. We'll take as many questions as there are, but please.
I'll just do a little bit of a wind-up to close, if you don't mind. Thanks very much for coming, but I just want to tell you a couple of things. I was at the town hall last night, and I asked the candidates a question. I asked them specifically, how would you diversify Jersey's economy? We've got some industries in decline, finance industry for one perhaps. So, what would you do if you got in about diversifying the economy? And I didn't get any good answers. I got one candidate who actually said, well, if I could think of a method of diversifying the economy, I'd be a millionaire. So, I'm going to give you a solution. I'm going to give you something to diversify the economy. Change around Jersey farming to a much more productive, ecologically sustainable system. That in itself will help the people of Jersey to live in a much better environment, better food, cleaner water, psychologically better because the environment's better. Now, not only that, but if we convert Jersey to chemical-free farming, we will be a world leader. We will create things like agro-tourism. People will flock to this island to see what we were doing. We can have schools, universities teaching this method. Eventually, you know, there was talk about developing education, maybe a college up at Fort Regent. That could have a department, particularly on regenerative farming methods, and people would flock from all over the world. So there's an idea to diversify the economy. Now, of all the things I do, and I do a lot in the background, this is by far my most important project, by tenfold, by 100-fold. If we can get rid of chemicals on our farmland over the next 5 to 10 years, we will save money. The hospital will not have so many patients to treat because of obesity. We will psychologically be better because the environment's better. For me, quite simply, it's a no-brainer. What's not to like? So please, if you could support us, if you get into government, or even if you don't, regenerative farming is the future. Please support us. If you would like to taste some Jersey Royals, we're not going to tell you which ones are which. There's A and there's B. It's quite obvious to me, you've just got to look at them. But please taste them, and then if you would kindly, and there's no pressure, write up your choice, A or B on the board next to your signature, and if you'd be happy to sign our pledge. And thanks very much for coming and for your support. Questions.